Okay, so this is the third of the crusading contingents that leave as a result of Urban's speech at Clermont. The one that is obviously the largest and the most successful, and comprised primarily of knights. And in part because of the success of the First Crusade, you do have this dissemination of accounts of battles and what happens, and a lot of those then later are copied and are illustrated. So we do have quite a few illustrations, contemporary illustrations of a lot of these battles and encounters with local Muslim groups. And as you can see from this one, so these are all would have been initially very small. They did not pull any punches, and they demonstrate sort of the extent of the violence and the brutality, the bloodshed, and that's all part of this sort of narrative of the crusade that we'll be tracing. So, who are the participants of this contingent? The leaders are Adhemar of Le Puy. Adhemar is actually a bishop. He is sort of the papal legate. So, he's sort of the point person that Urban sort of assigns to this group of knights. And in part because he doesn't have really anything at stake in terms of sort of a secular reputation or secular gain, he becomes sort of the person that everyone sort of looks to. In terms of nobles, you have a number of what we would call sort of lesser nobles. So Godfrey of Bouillon, this is actually Godfrey's castle. Bouillon is a pretty small county in what's now Belgium. Godfrey was by no means sort of in the upper ranks of the nobility in France during that time. And then his relative Baldwin, they spell their last name differently, and there's a reason for that, but we don't need to go into it. Baldwin of Boulogne goes as well. And then you do have sort of in some of the higher ranks, Hugh of Vermandois. So he's the brother of Philip I of France. Philip is not at all interested in the crusade. He's got other issues. He's excommunicated because he left his wife and married another woman who was already married. So he's sort of battling with the Pope separately. But his brother Hugh does go. Also, Bohemond of Toronto. Bohemond is Norman. He's from Sicily, and so you can kind of see the different routes they take. They also give you an indication of where they're from. So Bohemond is very familiar with the Byzantines. He's been fighting against them alongside his father for years, and his nephew Tancred of Galilee goes with him. Raymond of Saint Gilles, the Count of Toulouse, he is probably one of the highest ranking nobles to go. He is sort of advanced years compared to the others, but typically a lot of the others, at least early on, sort of defer to him. And then Robert, Duke of Normandy. So Robert of Normandy is actually the older brother of William, the King of England. But when their father died, he divided up his possessions. So Robert got Normandy and William got England. And there's some feuding between the two of them, and eventually Robert kind of sells Normandy to his brother for an enormous sum so he can go on crusade. In Robert's contingent are two others who we will mention. Stephen, Count of Blois, and then Fulcher of Chartres. And Fulcher of Chartres is a member of the clergy, and is we all are already familiar with. He sort of writes one of the accounts of the Crusades. So he was probably a chaplain in this contingent with Robert and Stephen. So along with those knights, you also have a considerable body of soldiers. Just not nobles, but sort of the knights who serve those soldiers. We do know that there are some archers, though these are pretty limited, and to the extent that archery it's not really a big component of sort of fighting at this stage, and most of these archers would have been using a crossbow. And then the infantry, just sort of the foot soldiers, the men who would have been marching with a spear or a lance. You also have a huge support staff, and this is why whenever we see numbers of how many people actually go on crusade in sources, we have to be cautious because it's not clear who all they're considering in their accounts. So all of these knights have large sort of immediate households. They have grooms. Most of the knights bring several horses. They have sort of their destriers, which they ride into battle, a very specific trained horse. But then they also have horses that are carrying their baggage, their supplies. So you need grooms to tend to these horses, smiths in case a horse throws a shoe or armor needs to be repaired, and then pages who sort of serve the knights. Then you also have sort of this wider range of support staff. So servants, people to bake the bread. These nobles don't make their own food. We also see glimpses in some of the contemporary accounts of like laundresses. So people who are sort of doing that menial work for the nobles in the army. Then members of the church, chaplains, priests, as well as a handful of sort of bishops or higher ranking clergy. Some of these men do bring their wives, though not most of them. It's sort of more rare, but we do know that it happens. At times they bring their children, though more common is the wives give birth along the way. And then we also know from some accounts that there are prostitutes and sort of camp followers who go along as well. And this is, I think, a great illustration. This is the Morgan Bible, and it shows that sort of diversity that would have sort of existed amongst this huge mass of people sort of marching to the east. So the first stage of their progress from Europe to Constantinople. So when Urban sort of issues the call, he says, okay, we're going to meet in Constantinople in 1096. And so the knights sort of go back home, they make these preparations, and then they begin the march. And we do see to some degree, because they're all sort of converging on Constantinople, some routes are a little bit more difficult than others. We do know that there are a few sort of groups that try and sail, and in some instances we see accounts of sort of ships sinking. Some of them get sort of diverted at the Battle of Lisbon in Portugal. We also see instances of people dying, disease, and desertion. And then in some instances when they go through sort of Hungary, around sort of the Belgrade area, there are skirmishes with local tribes. Remember, this group is the third of these large contingents, so some local folks are kind of wary of what exactly their interactions are going to be like, and in a lot of instances, those previous interactions haven't been that positive. But eventually, one by one, each sort of force arrives in Constantinople. Again, accounts tell us around 60,000 total. That might be a little bit elevated, and obviously only a certain percentage of that would be people capable of sort of armed conflict. The Byzantine Emperor Alexius greets them all, welcomes them warmly, gives them lots of gifts, but then demands that each of these sort of nobles, each of the guys that I mentioned before who are leading sort of contingents, swear an oath of allegiance. From Alexius's point of view, what this army is here to do is to help him regain lost territory and to reestablish his control, particularly over sort of Anatolia, Syria, sort of that southern part of the Byzantine Empire that he's recently lost to these Turkish groups. And the Crusaders are reluctant to take this oath, and there's a lot of sort of discrepancies as to whether or not they all did. Bohemond of Toronto in particular may have held out. And so we see that there's a lot of division already emerging amongst these guys. There's no sort of clear leader other than Adhemar. And so there's also a lot of rivalry between them. And increasingly moving forward, concerns about how to provision their followers, they're running out of supplies in Constantinople. They start out purchasing them, but eventually things are just scarce for everybody, and that becomes less and less of an option. We do know from accounts that for many of these crusaders, it was the first time they saw the capital at Constantinople, and they just expressed this awe at the magnificence of these buildings, how wealthy it was, how opulent all of the sort of the emperor's palaces were, and just sort of this admiration. So the next phase then, as they leave Constantinople, is conquest. And again, you can see a lot of these illustrations actually are pretty accurate depictions of what we see in text. We do know the first instance of sort of primitive biological warfare. When they laid siege to some of these cities, they would cut off the heads of some of the defenders, and then they would launch them back into the city to sort of increase the chance of disease. So the first major obstacle they encounter is the city of Nicaea. And Nicaea is at the very edge of the Byzantine Empire, and it has been recently captured by a Turkish commander named Kilja Arslan. And Kilja Arslan is sort of away. He's fighting another local Turk. And so eventually Godfrey of Bouillon arrives in May of 1097, and then the other sort of contingents as well. And so they have to figure out how are they going to approach these really large fortified cities like Nicaea. Nicaea is a very, very ancient city. It's encircled by 4 miles of walls. There are 200 defensive towers. It's moated on 3 sides. The 4th side, and you can kind of see here, is actually a lake. And so that Lake Ascanion. And so that makes it impossible to surround. And so although they immediately sort of implement a siege approach, so sappers sort of dig under the walls, trebuchets launch large rocks against the fortifications, or as we saw before, dead people. You also have battering rams. They begin to build siege towers. This becomes a really extended siege and gives them sort of enough time to alert Kilja Arslan to sort of come back with a force. So at one point we know that a scouting party arrives, and it's defeated by Raymond of Toulouse. So that's one of sort of the first successes the Crusaders experience. Kilja Arslan himself then returns. He's sort of confused as to who these people are and what they're doing. Initially, he thinks it must just be a Byzantine force, but then as he gets closer, he sees that they're not, in fact, Byzantine. And he sort of engages with a Crusader army. He is defeated and he withdraws. He actually leaves his wife, who's in the city, and his children, as well as his treasury. However, as long as the people inside Nicaea can bring in additional supplies over the lake, they can hold out sort of indefinitely. So the Crusaders appeal to Emperor Alexius, who brings some ships. And so he's able to blockade the city with some ships that he's brought from his nearby fortress at Kivito. On June 19th, it's starting to look like it's only a matter of time before the Crusaders have enough power to breach the walls. So they're sort of preparing for that to happen. They wake up the next morning to discover that Alexius, well, not Alexius himself because he's not there, but his forces have actually been in conversation with some of Kilja Arslan's men inside the city, and they have agreed to surrender, but only to Alexius. And so the Crusaders wake to see the flags of Alexius flying on the walls. They are not very happy about this. Obviously, they have to call off their assault. Alexius does sort of reward especially the leaders with some gifts, but this becomes a real source of discord as well as a source of suspicion about this sort of potential cooperation between Alexius's forces and these Crusaders. But in any case, they've captured Nicaea. They no longer have to worry about sort of having this Turkish force at their back. And so the sort of celebration and then the declaration in 5 weeks will be in Jerusalem. And that is not at all the case. We know that the first major encounter then, sort of major encounter between two really large-scale forces happened shortly after at the Battle of Dorylaeum. So when the Crusader forces leave Nicaea, Alexius has sort of counseled them to take the route along the coast. What he says is, then you only have to worry about being attacked on the landward side, and I can sort of ships sort of sail along the coast with provisions. And so this way, you won't be so dependent upon what you encounter as you sort of march over land. But there's that discord that happens as a result of Nicaea. There's suspicion, so they say, no, we're going to take this inland route, which we think is going to be faster anyway. However, they realize that with this massive number of people, provisions are going to be scarce. So they divide the army up into several different groups. Bohemond is going to go first, and then Godfrey and several others are going to follow about a day's march behind. And in the meantime, Kilij Arslan has sort of made peace with some of these other Turkish rulers with whom he was fighting, and he's gathered an army of his own. He finds out that Bohemond's army is about a day's march from Dorilam, and so he decides that he's going to attack him there. According to accounts, Kilij Arslan has between 25,000 and 150,000 men. That's probably really inflated, but in any case, we know that Bohemond's army is outnumbered about 4 or 5 to 1. Bohemond maybe has about 10,000 men. So Bohemond then, you can see from this super primitive map. So Bohemond, his scouts alert him to the approach of Kilij Arslan's army. He knows he's outnumbered. So what he does is he takes sort of all of the camp followers, all the non-combatants, he puts them in the center, and then he surrounds them with his armed men. And so he is in a position, he has time to kind of figure out where's the best sort of defensive stance. And you can kind of see here, there's a river on one side and a marsh on the other. And that's going to be really significant as the battle unfolds. So he then the first wave of Turkish attackers comes. The Turks fight on smaller, faster horses. They fight a lot of the times with archers. So before they engage, they will loose arrows as they attack. Their idea is to attack quickly and then to fall back and let another wave of attackers come quickly. And at times they fall back on purpose to try and lure their opponent to chase them. And then as they draw the troops away, they can sort of pick them off one by one. This type of fighting is not what the Crusaders are used to. These Crusaders are armed, heavily armed. It's very difficult for them to maneuver. They're not super flexible. And they're on these large horses that are slow because they have to support the weight of the Crusader. So initially when the Crusaders engage, they try to attack these Turks because that's how knights sort of fight typically, and it does not go well because these Turks are just too fast. They can outrun them. The archers don't really inflict too much damage on the Crusaders because they have their shields and their armor, but those non-combatants in the middle really take a huge hit, literally. So we know that they lose several thousand people. The battle seems to be on the side of the Turks. However, dividing that army up ended up being sort of fortuitous. So by noon, Bohemond has sent a scout to alert Godfrey. He eventually arrives with his forces. Others sort of gradually show up. And then the final straw is when Adhemar of Lopui arrives with his forces, he's actually able to flank the Turks. Those who aren't killed flee. They're able to seize the Turkish camp. They seize a lot of the treasure that Kilij Arslan leaves behind, and they sort of distribute it amongst themselves. And they also burn the camp down and sort of take any high-ranking hostages with them. So the Battle of Dorilam is a really significant sort of turning point. Some historians suggest that if the victory had not gone in the favor of the Crusaders, it may have sort of turned the tide, and you never would have had this whole crusading movement, because stories of failure would have sort of gotten back to Western Europe, as opposed to stories of this great success. They continue then on their route. They have to march through Anatolia, and you can see this picture. This is some really rough terrain. It's very hot. This is the middle of the summer. The local wells have been poisoned, so getting sources of fresh water next to impossible. There are very little places where they could even buy provisions, much less sort of plunder for them. And we start to see the knights themselves, stories of them sort of discarding their armor along the side of the road. Their horses are dying. So by the time they get through the Anatolian passes, only about a couple hundred horses are left. So these knights are walking. They're using like donkeys and mules to carry their baggage. And we also know there's a lot of disease, and increasingly there's sort of raiding parties alongside the hills that sort of pick off crusaders little by little. So they reach Antioch in October. And Antioch also is an extraordinarily well fortified city. This is a sort of a contemporary image of it. Obviously, it was much bigger than that. But just to give you an idea of how the siege sort of unfolds, the Crusaders camp outside of Antioch. They set up camp. They end up being there for 7.5 months. The local ruler is a man named Yagision. He knows he doesn't have the forces to defeat the Crusaders, but the walls of Antioch have this 2 miles worth of sort of citadel within the walls and 400 towers, and it's extraordinarily well provisioned. So he thinks if aid will eventually come, he has a chance of sort of holding out. And so this initiates sort of this extended period, just this war of attrition. So on both sides, supplies start to dwindle. Even the wealthiest of the Crusader leaders start to run out of money. They can't sort of provision their men. They can barely provision themselves. They make raids into sort of Turkish lands outside of Antioch. But as they sort of deplete those resources, they're forced to go sort of further and further away to find any sort of provisions to feed the army. So sometimes they're going 50 miles from Antioch. We know that particularly over the cold months, there's disease. The horses are dying. There's stories of people sort of forced to eat these horses after they die because they have no food. We also know their desertions. Probably the most sort of high-profile deserter is Stephen of Blois. He decides that this is just not happening, that this is foolish. And as he's going back towards Western Europe, he actually runs into Alexios. And Alexios was bringing an army with him. And Stephen says, just forget it. It's a lost cause. It's never going to happen. And so Alexios does. And that's going to be significant moving forward. Some of the sort of clergy members with the Crusaders decide that they're not having success because of sin, that the men are gambling to pass the time, that they're visiting local prostitutes, that they're raping local women. And so what they need to do is they need to sort of atone, to sort of get God's favor back. So Adamlar suggests a 3-day fast. We know that they start to hear word of the march of this relief force. Kerboga, who is in charge of the city of Mosul, is bringing an army to try and relieve the siege of Antioch. While all of this has been going on, Bowman of Toronto has been engaged in secret conversations with someone within the city of Antioch. It's probably an Armenian merchant. And what Bowman says is, look, if you cooperate, if you help me out, I'll spare you, I'll spare your family, and I promise we won't sort of kill any of the Armenian Christians within the walls. And so eventually on June 3rd, in the middle of the night, this man opens sort of a side gate to Bowman's forces. Once Bowman's forces enter the city, obviously everyone is completely surprised. They just sort of go on a rampage. They massacre anyone they can see, including the person that they weren't supposed to kill and his family, the Armenians. And then they open the gates for the rest of the Crusader forces to enter. We do know that this is some pretty gruesome stuff, and the eyewitness accounts tell us about the enslavement of women and children. They're convinced that these local Muslims have hidden their gold, and in some instances, they're convinced that they swallowed it instead of letting the Crusaders have it. And this illustration is of these corpses. So these are dead Muslims, and then they sort of slit their stomachs open because they're trying to find this gold that they believe is hidden. The Turks still control the citadel in the innermost part of the city, and now the Crusaders control everything around it, but they still have to seize control of that citadel. And in the meantime, Kerboga's forces arrive, and so they've surrounded the Crusaders. So now the Crusaders are trapped within the city between the Turkish forces in the citadel and Kerboga's forces. This is one of those sort of moments that enters into sort of this urban history. Peter Bartholomew is a priest who's along on the crusade, and he says that St. Andrew came to him in a vision and told him that there is a place in Antioch where the Holy Lance that was used to sort of slit the side of Jesus when Jesus was on the cross, it's buried there. And he knows where it is. And so he goes and they dig and they dig and they dig and they don't find it. And then they go back the next day and they dig and they dig and they dig and they find something. And he says, hey, it's the Holy Lance. Most of the leaders of the crusade do not believe that this is the Holy Lance, Bowman in particular, but it does inspire some of the foot soldiers who are willing to sort of believe that this is a sign from God that they are going to have victory. So on June 28th, Bohemund actually leads the Crusaders out and engages Kerboga's forces in open field. Even though they're outnumbered, they are successful. This is an illustration. So the person with sort of the pointy hat on the left, that's actually Adhemar of Lepuy. He's a bishop, so he has the bishop's mitre on top of his armor, and he's carrying the Holy Lance. And so this is sort of viewed as responsible for this victory. Shortly after Kerboga is defeated, the Turks surrender. And then the question becomes, well, what's going to happen with Antioch? Bohemund thinks it should be his. Raymond thinks it should be his. And so you have this extended period of time when the army just kind of camps outside of Antioch, makes some forays around. The rank and file say, hey, why aren't we headed to Jerusalem? But no one wants to leave Antioch because they're afraid in their absence, someone else is going to take it. On August 1st, however, Adhemar of Lepuy dies. And so the one person that everyone else sort of acknowledged in terms of leadership is gone. And so this actually accelerates this deterioration of the relationships between these various noble leaders. Eventually, however, by January, the rank and file soldiers are just done. So they say they actually burn down a fortress where Raymond of Toulouse is staying to force him to march. And so Raymond, kind of reluctantly, but this is what he's here for, decides to assume command of the army. Bohemund stays back in Antioch. On May 13th, they sort of make their way down, and you can see Antioch, Jerusalem is not exactly a short distance. They go along the coast, and you have such division within this Turkish world. So Tripoli is a large, wealthy port city that's actually controlled by an Arab Muslim who he himself is at war with the local Turkish Muslims. So when the Crusaders arrive, he says, absolutely, I'm not going to resist. I'll actually sell you supplies and provisions and help you on your way. And so this sort of division amongst these local Muslim groups allows the Crusaders to make significant progress. There are a few places where they do are forced to sort of militarily attack cities or villages, but in a lot of instances, these port cities like Sidon and Tyre and Acre are more than happy to establish a truce and to let the Crusaders pass. So eventually they get to Jerusalem on the 7th of June. This is a much quicker siege than Antioch, actually. Godfrey of Bouillon assumes command of the army. Jerusalem is pretty well fortified. The walls are about 50 feet high, and there is about 2.5 miles of wall surrounding the city with numerous sort of towers and gates. However, just because of local infighting between Turks and Fatimid Muslims, a lot of those walls are sort of in a state of disrepair. The city itself is kind of in ruins in some places. And so you've got this Fatimid garrison who is in control of these Turkish warriors. And so those two are sort of at odds. The governor of Jerusalem forces the local Christians to leave because he's afraid of what's going to happen at Antioch, where someone sort of made an alliance with the Crusaders, though some Christians do remain in the city. And we know that there's a sizable Jewish population in the city as well. He poisons all the wells, so to try and make life difficult for the Crusader forces. And he appeals to Egypt for a relief force, and he hopes that that will come before the Crusaders can make inroads against the walls. So the first phase is they sort of go up north and they get some wood so that they can construct some siege equipment. Some ships from Genoa, from Italy, have arrived with provisions. They are able to secure a source of fresh water, though it's quite a distance from the camp. Probably about 1,500 knights, maybe 12,000 infantry. You also have a sizable number of camp followers. Things do not immediately go in their favor. So on the 8th of July, a sort of a local or one of the leading sort of members of the clergy who's with the crusading army says, look, we're not penitent enough. Remember that 3-day fast we did before Antioch? We need to sort of do something like that. So there's actually a penitential procession around the city. He encourages them to pray and to fast. And he sends the prostitutes over a hill so that they're out of the way to try and decrease the sin. This, though, however, doesn't actually cause the walls to magically fall like he had promised the people they would. But in the meantime, the nobles have continued to put into place siege equipment to conquer the city. So initially we do have, and you can see this sort of illustration of Jerusalem and the walls. They specifically concentrate all their forces on a couple of gates in the north, and they build siege towers. They sort of fill in this ditch that separates the wall from how close they can get. So they fill it in with dirt so that they can get their siege towers right up to the walls. And eventually they are able to also get a battering ram to break through a wall at the same place that they get a siege tower so that some of Raymond's men can go over the wall at the same place. Once the Crusader forces are inside, they open the gates, and then this unleashes several days worth of looting and massacres. And we'll read some accounts about what happens in Jerusalem. No members of the population are spared. Any local Christians that they find are killed because they didn't ally with the Crusaders. Muslims are killed. We know that a significant portion of the Jewish community takes refuge in the synagogue. They put that on fire, and about 300 to 500 Jews burned to death. So the sort of massacres that follow are going to be part of this story of the conquest of Jerusalem. So July 15, Jerusalem falls to the Crusader army. The Pope's dreams have been realized. Unfortunately, Urban dies on the 29th of July, and we know that he dies before he gets the news that Jerusalem is actually in the hands of the Crusaders. So he did not know that his effort was successful, and then it's up to his followers to sort of continue with this mission.